Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, all the football you love in one place. Across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
This is News Talk.
Now you're very welcome back. So Newcastle return to the Champions League, first time since 2002, and it seems much like Graham Potter, Eddie Howe's first ever Champions League game will be one he manages in. Is the word. He's never been to a Champions League game before, so it's all feel good on Tyneside. Very happy to say Ciaran Kelly from the Newcastle Evening Chronicle is with us. Evening, Ciaran. Thanks for the time.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Very well. So 20 years ago, with Newcastle and the Champions League, it was a case of everybody's second team kind of vibes. The 1990s popularity into Bobby Robson's time. I think it's fair to say Newcastle are operating in a more complicated space in 2023. We'll come on to the off the pitch aspect in a few moments, but to talk on the pitch, you might give us a sense of how you think they've managed to do this so quickly. The takeover was in October of 21. Steve Bruce didn't last very long. Eddie Howe arrived November 21. He took them from relegation to 11th in his first season, and now Champions League football second season. This is way out of schedule. I don't think many people predicted this in year two. So talk to us. What are you seeing up there week to week?
Yeah, I think you speak to anyone behind the scenes, they won't say this is down to one thing. It's been a whole host of factors that have come together in the past 18 months. Like you say, I think last summer their recruitment was again savvy, and the players they brought in elevated the team once more with Nick Pope, Sven Botman and Alexander Isak. It's a real strong spine, players who are going to grow with the club. And then, they had the benefit of Eddie Howe's pre-season. Eddie Howe's first full pre-season was really important. It's easy to forget this Newcastle team were a team that relied on transitions, on counter-attack, were ones that sat back only, last season. Now they're a front foot team. They get in your face. They win the ball high up the pitch. They're a team that can really ruffle feathers and go toe to toe rather with anyone. So there's been that aspect. I think the togetherness and spirit that's been at the club is such a powerful force, and it's probably hard to put into words really, because for so long this was a club that wasn't united. The fans were fragmented. It was a club that once had to give away 10,000 half-season tickets, which at any club is unimaginable. But in Newcastle, it was particularly striking, and it showed the apathy in those final years of the Ashley era. Whereas now, from top to bottom, I think everyone's rowing in the same direction, and that's taken the club really far.
They have spent the guts of 250 million sterling across this period, which is similar to Spurs. This isn't an outrageous splurge by any means. Trippier for 12 million, remarkable value. I'm sure he's getting a good wage, but remarkable value nonetheless. Sven Botman, Isak for 60 million looks like, by the standards of today, to be good value. Bruno Guimaraes for 35 million, again exceptional value I would think. Dan Burn 13 million, Nick Pope 10 million. Who's driving that? Because the shrewdness there, I mean, let's be honest, Ciaran, we were all hoping for a Robinho period at Newcastle and it hasn't quite happened.
No, I think they maybe looked at the Man City situation. They've looked at what clubs have done wrong previously. They had templates to learn from and do it their way. And let's be honest, was anyone else going in for Dan Burn when he joined Newcastle? They've been really smart. This, as you said, hasn't just been about throwing money at it. Look at what Chelsea have done in the past two windows, what they've spent. Just because you have money doesn't mean you spend it right. They've been very shrewd, and it's all about alignment behind the scenes. They've got a transfer committee who are very much on the same page, whether it's Eddie Howe, whether it's the head of recruitment, Steve Nixon, whether it's sporting director Dan Ashworth. They're all very much aligned in what a Newcastle United target looks like. That's someone who really fits that kind of range on the continent of, being under 24, who can grow with the club, who could be someone who can be there to help them challenge to get in a spot in the Champions League, but also can play in the Champions League, could potentially one day be part of a side that challenges for trophies. They're very much got a real profile built there, and I think that's what they're going to continue to do this summer.
And despite the endless wealth of the Saudi PIF, the club have routinely made the point that financial fair play rules prohibit them from going out and dropping $500 million in a summer. Is that what you're hearing on the ground, that is the primary driver as opposed to shrewdness. They simply can't go out and spend the kind of money that they could afford to spend.
Yeah, it's like you said, they're so far ahead of schedule that the revenues haven't caught up, because you have to remember how neglected the club was before the takeover. Commercially, it was a non-entity. The training ground was Championship League One standard. This was the starting point of what Newcastle was when it was taken over, and I think they haven't been able to push it forward so quickly overnight. But I think that's actually worked in their favour. Building sustainably. Bringing in those Dan Burns, like I mentioned, that's been smart business. If they went straight into signing, I don't know, Zapata from Atalanta, or these kind of players who might have been available, I don't think that would have necessarily been the right way. I think that it's been very character driven. They've gone for players who want to play for the club, and for years we've heard people don't want to play for Newcastle because of where the geography is. And you mentioned Kieran Trippier and money there. He took a pay cut to come to Newcastle because he wanted to come back to the north of England. I know you might think that isn't true, but it is. That people want to play for the club. The project appeals to them, and I think that's put them in good stead. But like you said, the off the field side of it has to catch up. Getting the Champions League one-off will be a huge benefit for them, but I think to really benefit now, they're going to have to do that year on year.
You mentioned Howe's first pre-season with the team as being important, and I suppose that is borne out in the nature of their performances now. As you said, they are front foot. The physicality of this team is right up there with any team in the Premier League. Any number of performances. A lot of people might have seen the Manchester United game a couple of weeks ago at St James's Park. They ran all over Manchester United. It was just so stark, that difference in physicality. And married to the atmosphere at St James's Park, I would think it's a pretty phenomenal place to be covering football every week for you. It really is in sync, the atmosphere in the stands with the type of football they're playing. I don't know if Eddie Howe's been asked at any stage, did he try and play a style of football which would prompt that kind of reaction from the stands, or is it just a more organic, happy coincidence? I remember a couple of years ago, for instance, I think it was when Belgian manager, name's gone out of my head, got relegated with Wigan, was one of Everton's managers,
Roberto Martinez.
Yeah. When he was at Goodison, and Carragher was making the point, this style of football doesn't fit in with this crowd. It's just not going to work. Goodison is high tempo, high octane. That's just the way it has to be. And an Everton manager should recognise that. Be really curious if Howe's ever spoken about that issue at all.
Yeah, I think he did his research on the DNA of Newcastle United before he took the job. He grew up watching Kevin Keegan's teams. He actually spoke to Kevin Keegan before he took the job. He was one of the first people he spoke to, interestingly. But I think his style of play fitted that DNA anyway. You look at his Bournemouth teams, they mightn't have had the same profile in terms of media, but they were teams that would go toe-to-toe with the best in the business. And I think he was well suited in that regard. But the big thing for me, what's been so striking is defensively they've been so good that he went away during his break, and that defensive stability that Newcastle have, there very few teams have conceded fewer goals in Europe than Newcastle in the top leagues, and that's given them a real foundation to build from. And I think him embracing that side of the game has really shown how he's evolved as a manager. He's still a young manager, and that's really been to Newcastle's benefit, because before he took charge, Newcastle's DNA was sitting back, inviting pressure, trying to nick a fluky goal against a top team. It's not what the fans wanted. They wanted a team that was willing to get in people's faces, and they're getting that now in spades. Yeah,
and people can roll their eyes when you talk about DNA or what the fans want, but if you haven't been to St James's Park, then you could be a bit quick to write that off, and naively so. It is a reality of the football up there, and the defensive point is very well made as well, because that was a criticism of Howe at Bournemouth. So he seems to be in an extraordinary place. Everything about it seems to be good. They would be right back to most people's second favourite team again, were it not for where I'm going. So you're up there, Ciaran. I'm judging by your accent, you're not a local lad.
Believe it or not.
Yeah. If you write for the the Newcastle Chronicle, I don't know how often you've done it, for instance, but if you write a piece which is along the lines of everything is so good in so many ways, but to be honest, there is lots about the Saudi project that we should not feel good about or we have to question, what tends to be the reaction? How visceral is it? What kind of truck does that line of thinking generate these days up in Newcastle?
The thing is, I think it's dangerous to go into writing something thinking about that. I think you have to write what you feel and what you believe in. So, for example, when the Saudi kit leaked last summer, I didn't feel comfortable with that. I wrote that, not thinking, oh, I'm going to get pelters for that. I think it's dangerous to go down that road of what will people think. Personally, what I will say is Newcastle United fans are intelligent. It isn't 52,000 people with tea towels on their heads. Like, I think sometimes people outside the region perceive them to be. They're smart people who are very aware of what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But we shouldn't judge them if they want to focus on the football as well. It's their club. They didn't have a say on who was the owner before the Saudis came in. They don't have a say on who the owner is now. I think there's maybe a feeling for them that they feel like sometimes they're being ganged up on, and I think they can be wrongly painted sometimes. So it's a good platform just to get that across. But for me, I think personally, anytime I've written pieces on the owners, you want to make sure that you have that in mind, and you're thinking about what amnesty have come out with. You're looking at the human rights abuses. You wouldn't be a human being if you didn't do that.
Yeah. So I take the point in the fans. I've never seen any expression of unease about the owners at the games.
There have been outside the stadium on the ground. Yeah, there have been protest groups, but yeah, let's put it this way: when we did a poll here at the Chronicle before the takeover happened, it was 99% of fans were in favour of it.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming in favour of it, and I think though to understand that, maybe you do have to understand what came beforehand, what happened for 14 years, that people literally walked away from their season tickets, that the apathy was so overwhelming, that supporters felt so disillusioned that it's gone the other way. In the space of 18 months, the club has flipped, and the feeling around the city has flipped.
Yeah, it does feel like they've adopted a Millwall-esque "nobody likes us and we don't care" type of attitude. That is the sense I get from Newcastle fans now.
I think there's, in the northeast, maybe there's a feeling that they're painted in a certain way, that they're forgotten about, that they're looked upon differently from other parts of the country, whether it be in government investment and what have you. And I think this idea that us against the world, like you say, being booed off at Anfield, being booed off at Selhurst Park, Crystal Palace aren't traditional rivals for Newcastle United. I think the players, the fans, they've embraced that. The unofficial motto is, they're not here to be liked, they're here to compete. And I think they've taken that on, and it's become part of the club now.
It was interesting as well that the purchase was approved very much on the basis, in the Premier League's eyes, less so I think in the British government's eyes, but on the Premier League's eyes, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would not have any control over the club. And the Premier League said that was a, quote, clear condition, and they said, quote, it couldn't be in any way controlled by the Saudi government. And so the purchase went through, therefore we can assume that assurances were given. Then, like a couple of months ago, you see the Live golf case in California, and the Live people there own the same ownership as Newcastle, in effect. They want to prevent certain documents being made available for discovery. And their argument is, sorry, we're not ordinary third parties. You're infringing on the sovereignty of the state. This is an instrument of the state. We have a sitting member of the Saudi government who happens to be the Newcastle chairman. Therefore, these documents, you can't just treat us like Ciaran Kelly and Joe Molloy here. We're the government. So, I mean, it's making a laughingstock of the whole situation. Like, it's obvious what's gone on here, and the Premier League facilitated it. And, like, it's a disgrace. And I don't even say that with much passion, because I think we're all just so beaten down by the lack of regulation in the world of football. But it is a disgrace. I mean, the assurances that were given, and look what they're saying in a court of law in California just a few months ago. So I don't know how anybody at the club can stand over that. And I don't know if they're being asked about that all that often.
Well, listen, I mean, the Yasser Al-Rumayyan has yet to speak to the media here. We would love to put these questions to him. He's obviously the chairman of the club, who you mentioned is the governor of the PIF. But I think this really just came down to piracy for the Premier League. I think this whole idea of, written assurances and that they had those written assurances going back when the takeover stalled. The issue was the blockade around the piracy. And once that was lifted, it's not a coincidence, the takeover happened. But I don't think you'll ever hear the Premier League come out and say that. And for me, the horse that kind of bolted when it comes to the ownership model that the Premier League welcomed in many years ago. And again, if the PIF didn't buy Newcastle United, they would have bought another football club, whether it be in this country or somewhere else.
Yeah. You're not wrong in saying that, and yet it's such a weak excuse, isn't it, really? And that's just the reality of the situation. On Eddie Howe, and he's handled the accusations of sports washing, I mean, fairly or otherwise, he's the public face of the club most of the time. And so I remember him being asked about it, certainly when he took the job first, certainly around the time of the 81 executions, many of them beheadings for not the most egregious of crimes as well. In the space of one weekend, it blew up again in a big way. He was asked about it, and it was pretty weak as well. It was like, I'm too busy with football to be on top of a lot of this stuff. I'll read up on it. How routinely is he asked about the fact that he is the public face of a sports washing project?
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly when it's always a hot issue, but when it's in the news, when, like you say, that Live Golf case, it came up again. It's probably every 2 or 3 months that he's been asked about this, but the response hasn't changed. In some ways, it shouldn't fall to him to be in front of the cameras. I would personally like the owners to be asked these questions, because that's who it's relevant to. I know, yes, he's the manager of the football club, but for me, it should be Yasser Al-Rumayyan who should be sitting in front of reporters and facing these questions. But I don't think we will see that day, personally, not anytime soon.
Well, listen, if you get the one-on-one with them, we'd love to talk to you about it. And I guess the last question on this whole area, and we would find it ourselves when we talk about Newcastle, and I suspect you're acutely conscious of it week on week. It's difficult to know to what extent it should be a point of emphasis. Like, do we have a ticker running along the bottom of the screen of our conversation at all times saying we have serious misgivings about Newcastle, misgivings about how Eddie Howe's answered the questions about the ownership, as we're talking about what a great job he's done. It is just this cloud over what should be the biggest party since 2002.
Yeah, possibly outside the region. I don't think I think you would have to caveat every little thing that happens to the club from here on in if that's the way it's going. I think I'd compare it a bit to the Man City situation, how people are kind of interpreting that and then getting their head around that, that there's this asterisk beside Man City's achievements now until otherwise proven. Yeah, it's not going to go away for Newcastle United. I think it's always going to be there in the background, probably even more so as the club gets more successful. These are questions that we have to face and have to ask. Yeah,
how equipped finally are they for two fronts next year, Champions League?
Yeah, it's the big challenge. Even if you look at taking on the European football, we've seen with West Ham how difficult it's been for them to juggle. Newcastle played such a high intensity, one of the most intense teams in the Premier League. To then do that in the Champions League a few days later, it's going to be a big ask. But I think their mentality is very much they're not just happy to qualify. They want to go and make a dent in the competition. So I'd expect them to bring in those 4 or 5 elite additions this summer to really take that squad on, because they need that bit of depth. I think we saw in January, maybe when they were knocked out of the FA Cup by Sheffield Wednesday, they played a lot of their fringe players there, and they just weren't up to it. And to really compete at both levels, you need players to sub in who are nearly as good as each other. And there are certain areas in that team that they need that added quality. So I think they're well aware of the challenge. They're well ahead of schedule, of course, but who'd have thought Sean Longstaff would be playing in the Champions League 2 years ago? But he looks like he's going to be a big part of it. It's the same with people like Fabian Schär, Miguel Almiron, Joe Linton. These players have improved so much, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, I guess.
No, sorry, on the football side of things, it's exceptional. I mean, Eddie Howe has done an exceptional job. He really has. It's to be marvelled at. And the 2 points we made about him aren't mutually exclusive by any means. As a last one, and you mentioned Joe Linton, who's just a joy to watch. I mean, he's a freak of nature in there. He's so good. Is there any insight into how Eddie Howe has managed to improve all of these players? Because in some ways that is the most admirable aspect of the job.
I think it's a combination of just modern. He's a modern manager. These players didn't have that sort of coaching for a while. From what we understand, it sounds so simple. You should expect a manager to improve players, but for many years, a lot of these players were stagnating. Sean Longstaff, for example, looked a player who was lost, who really needed someone to save his career almost, even though he's still so young. And you look how Eddie Howe's come in and done that. Same with Joe Linton. Joe Linton, I know it was maybe a bit of an accident that he ended up in midfield, but just look how he's improved in that position, how he's improved year on year, and still next year can go up another level. I think it's just having a manager who knows how to get the best out of his players, who can give them those detailed instructions that they need, because these are intelligent footballers, but I just don't think they were maximised under the previous manager, and they have a manager now who's able to get the best out of them.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. Listen, I suspect an exciting season for you next year. Get the passport ready, get going. Thanks so much for your time, Ciaran. Appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Cheers. Ciaran Kelly there from the Newcastle Chronicle, and our football show coverage is brought to you by Sky. Don't miss Brighton Man City this Wednesday, live only on Sky Sports. Back in 1 sec.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, proud partner and supporter of the Republic of Ireland women's national football team.
This is News Talk.